Of all these strange and bewildering tales that have crossed the threshold of our modest lodgings at 221B Baker Street, there are few that linger in the mind with such a chilling persistence as the affair of the Dutch steamship Friesland. It was a case that presented, at its outset, a perfect and impenetrable void, a mystery not of commission, but of omission, not of what was there, but of what was so profoundly and unnervingly absent. The events began on a raw and foggy November morning, a day when the very air of London seemed a tangible, brooding presence, seeping through window frames and laying a damp, spectral hand upon the heart. I was seated by the fire, endeavouring to decipher the leading article in the Daily Telegraph, while Sherlock Holmes, in a fit of his peculiar self-inflicted languor, was draped over the sofa, the very picture of intellectual despair. The room was pungent with the acrid scent of some recent chemical experiment, and a litter of glass, vials and retorts on the deal-top table bore witness to a mind that could only find solace from the mundane by plunging into the abstruse. Crime is commonplace, Watson, and existence is notoriously dull, he sighed without opening his eyes. Can you imagine a world devoid of mystery? It would be a featureless plain of intolerable ennui. The criminal mind, in its predictable grubby machinations, is becoming a bore. Robbery, assault, the dreary domestic murder. It is all the same worn-out play on 1,000 different stages. Before I could muster a defence of our city's criminal element, the sharp peal of the doorbell echoed from downstairs. It was a sound that, in our quarters, seldom heralded the commonplace. Holmes sat up, his lethargy vanishing as if by magic. A flicker of interest, the first I had seen in days, ignited in his keen grey eyes. "A client, Watson, and at this hour. The game, as they say, is afoot." Mrs. Hudson soon ushered in a man whose entire being seemed to be a testament to profound distress. He was elderly, with a neatly trimmed white beard, and the pallor of one who had not slept for many nights. His dark, formal suit, though of expensive cut, was rumpled, and his hands trembled as he clutched a Homburg hat. He introduced himself in a heavily accented but precise English as Mr. Hendrik van der Heuvel, the principal owner of the Van der Heuvel shipping line of Amsterdam. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice raspy with anxiety, "I have been told that you are a man who can see light where all others see only darkness. I find myself in the deepest, most impenetrable darkness of my life." "You are welcome to my humble abode," said Holmes, gesturing to the armchair opposite him. "Pray, compose yourself and lay before us the particulars of your case. You may speak freely, for my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, has been privy to secrets that could topple empires." Our visitor took a deep, shuddering breath. "It is my ship, Mr. Holmes, the Steamship Friesland. She is one of the jewels of my fleet, a fine, modern vessel of over 3,000 tons. She was bound from Batavia in the Dutch East Indies with a full cargo of spices, tea and silks. Her journey was, by all accounts, uneventful. She was sighted off the coast of Portugal, and her master, Captain de Vries, telegraphed a message of "all's well," proceeding on schedule. 2 days ago she was towed into the port of London and moored at the East India docks. He paused, swallowing hard, as if the next words were stones in his throat. "And?" prompted Holmes, leaning forward, his long, thin fingers steepled before him. "And she is empty, Mr. Holmes, utterly empty. The entire crew, 34 souls, from Captain de Vries down to the youngest cabin boy, has vanished. I confess I let out an involuntary exclamation. Holmes, however, remained impassive, his gaze fixed upon the Dutchman's tormented face. "Vanished?" he repeated, his voice quiet but intense. "Describe the condition of the vessel." "That is the most shocking part," Mr. van der Heuvel cried, his composure finally cracking. "The ship is in perfect order. There is no sign of a struggle, no hint of piracy or mutiny. The ship's chronometers were wound, the lamps were trimmed. In the galley, a meal was found, half-eaten upon the table. The men's belongings are in their chests, their pipes and tobacco pouches on their bunks. The cargo, worth a fortune, is untouched in the hold. It is as if the men themselves simply evaporated into the sea air." "Were there no signs of violence? No ropes cut? No lifeboats missing?" "None. Scotland Yard is baffled. They speak of mass desertion, but for what reason? Captain de Vries was a man of impeccable character, with a family in Rotterdam and a spotless 40-year record. His men were loyal and well paid. To abandon a ship in such a way, leaving their wages and all their worldly possessions behind, it is unthinkable." "What of the ship's logbook?" Holmes inquired. "That is the one thing, and the only thing that is missing. The logbook, which should have been secured in the captain's cabin, is gone." "Intriguing," Holmes murmured, his eyes gleaming. "It suggests a deliberate effort to erase the history of the voyage, at least its final chapters. Was anything else out of place? Anything at all, no matter how trivial it may seem?" Mr. van der Heuvel hesitated, frowning in concentration. "There was one small thing. I hesitate to even call it a clue. It is bizarre. On the captain's desk, lying inside a spare leather glove, my port agent found this." He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in a silk handkerchief. He carefully unwrapped it and placed it on the table between us. It was a wooden bird, no more than 3 inches long, carved with an astonishing and meticulous artistry. Its form was sleek and predatory, with a cruel, hooked beak and elegantly swept-back wings. The wood was a deep, lustrous black, and it was carved in a style that was alien to me, evoking a sense of primal, savage grace. "What species of bird is it?" I asked, leaning closer to inspect it. "That is another mystery," our client replied. "Ornithological experts from the London Zoological Society have examined it. It corresponds to no known species, living or extinct." Holmes picked up the strange effigy, his eyes narrowed to slits. He turned it over and over, examining it not as a piece of art, but as a piece of evidence. He produced his powerful pocket lens and scrutinized the base, the texture of the wood, the very tool marks left by the carver's knife. "This is no common trinket," he remarked at last, his voice resonating with suppressed excitement. "The wood itself is of a most unusual density, and the craftsmanship speaks of a singular culture. You say the ship came from Batavia?" "Yes, the heart of the Dutch colonial empire, a crossroads of 100 different peoples and cultures." Holmes placed the bird back on the table. For a long moment he was silent, lost in that profound concentration that could transform his features into a mask of stone. I could see the cogs of his magnificent brain beginning to whir, piecing together the first fragments of this extraordinary puzzle. His languor was a distant memory, replaced by the fierce, focused energy of the hunter who has just caught the scent of a truly worthy quarry. "Mr. van der Hovel," he said, rising to his feet, "this is no common police matter. The problem you have brought me is one of the most remarkable I have encountered in some years. It is, if I may say so, a jewel of a case. The utter vacuity of the scene is in itself a clue of the highest order. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so do I. We must fill this one. Watson, your hat and coat. We make for the East India Docks at once. We must see this silent vessel for ourselves before the clumsy boot heels of the constabulary have trampled every subtle trace into oblivion." As we rattled through the gaslit, fog-shrouded streets in a hansom cab, Holmes spoke little, his mind clearly racing far ahead of our physical journey. He puffed furiously on his pipe. The smoke wreathed around his sharp, aquiline features, creating a veil through which his eyes shone with an almost feral intensity. For him, the game was no longer merely afoot. It was in full, exhilarating flight. The East India Docks were a chaotic labyrinth of cranes, shipping containers, and the towering masts of vessels from every corner of the globe. The fog here was thicker still, mingling with the coal smoke and the brackish scent of the Thames to create an atmosphere of profound melancholy. The Friesland was moored at a secluded berth, a dark, hulking shape against the grey water, looking less like a ship than a floating tomb. A uniformed constable stood guard at the gangplank, and he readily admitted us upon seeing the official-looking card of Inspector Gregson, whom Holmes had telegraphed en route. Gregson himself met us on deck. He was a stout, energetic man, but his usual bluff confidence was noticeably absent. His face was etched with puzzlement. "Holmes, I thought I might see you here," he grumbled. "This is a queer business, and no mistake. It's as if a snatch squad of angels or devils came down and spirited the whole crew away. Not a drop of blood, not a scuff mark. One moment they were here, the next, gone." "You have formulated a theory, I presume, Inspector?" Holmes asked, his eyes already sweeping the deck, taking in every detail of the rigging, the state of the paintwork, the position of the coiled ropes. "Mass desertion is the only logical explanation," Gregson said, though he did not sound convinced. "Perhaps they were lured away by the promise of some great fortune in the Americas, but it doesn't hold water. Why leave everything behind? Why not take the ship's valuables? It makes no sense." "That is because it is not the correct explanation," Holmes said crisply. "Logic is a magnificent tool, but it requires data. We have as yet far too little. With your permission, I should like to make my own examination." For the next 2 hours, I followed Holmes as he moved about the silent vessel, and I was, as always, captivated by the sheer, focused intensity of his method. He was a whirlwind of observation. He did not merely look, he saw. While Gregson and his men had seen a clean ship, Holmes saw 1,000 minute details that told a story. He ran his fingers along the railings, he sniffed the air in the companionways, he examined the very dust on the floor. His first port of call was the captain's cabin. It was neat and orderly. A pipe lay in an ashtray, half filled with ash. A book on nautical charts lay open on the bunk. Holmes ignored these obvious items and went straight to the cabin door. "Look here, Watson," he murmured, pointing to the heavy brass handle and lock mechanism. He brought his lens to bear on the metal. "Do you see these? Faint scratches, almost invisible to the naked eye. They are circumferential to the keyhole. This lock was not opened with its key. It was manipulated, picked by a very skilled hand, and from the outside. From the cabin, he proceeded to the ship's radio room. Here again, everything seemed in order. The equipment was archaic by modern standards, but functional. Holmes, however, was not interested in the machinery. He dropped to his hands and knees and examined the floor beneath the operator's desk. With the tip of a fine penknife, he scraped a small amount of dark reddish dust into a carefully prepared envelope, which he labelled and placed in his pocketbook. Our tour continued to the galley. The half-eaten meal of salt beef and biscuits was still on the table, a morbid tableau of interrupted life. But it was the spice rack that drew Holmes's attention. He opened each jar, sniffing the contents. "Curious," he muttered. "The cinnamon, the nutmeg, the pepper, all are nearly full, yet the jar of cloves is almost empty. Cloves have a powerful aromatic scent, often used to mask other odours." On a nearby cutting board, a half-peeled orange sat next to a knife, its exposed flesh dried and discoloured. The simple domestic detail made the absence of the cook all the more poignant. Our final destination was the cavernous cargo hold. Gregson's men had already confirmed the manifest was correct, and the crates were undisturbed. But Holmes insisted on descending into the lower secondary hold, a dark and musty space used for storing ship's supplies and excess tackle. As we descended the ladder, a peculiar odour met my nostrils. It was faint, yet cloying and sickly sweet, an alien scent that had no place on a working cargo vessel. "You smell it, Watson?" Holmes whispered, his voice sharp in the echoing darkness. He lit a lantern, its yellow light casting long dancing shadows. "Yes, it's a strange, sweet smell, like overripe fruit or some exotic flower." "Precisely." He did not linger. He swept the lantern beam around the hold once, his gaze taking in the stacked coils of rope and canvas sails, and then turned for the ladder. He had seen all he needed to see. Back on deck, the fog seemed to be closing in, muffling the sounds of the docks and isolating the Friesland in a world of its own. Gregson was waiting for us, his face a mask of impatient curiosity. "Well, Holmes, have you found anything to contradict my theory of desertion?" "My dear Inspector," Holmes replied, a thin smile playing on his lips, "I have found everything. This crew did not desert. They were, in the most complete and final sense of the word, removed. The question is not where they went, but how they were taken, and by whom. The little wooden bird was not left as a clue. It was a message. And the true crime committed here was not the disappearance of 34 men, but the successful arrival of a most sinister and unwelcome passenger." With that cryptic pronouncement, he turned on his heel and led the way down the gangplank, leaving a bewildered Inspector Gregson staring after us into the swirling grey mist. Watson and I followed, my mind a whirl of questions. A picked lock, volcanic dust, an empty jar of cloves, and a sickly sweet smell. What conceivable narrative could bind together such disparate and bizarre threads? I knew from long experience that my friend held all the keys, but for now he was content to let me fumble in the dark. Upon our return to Baker Street, Holmes plunged into a period of intense and silent activity that I knew well. It was the intellectual storm that preceded the lightning flash of revelation. The great ship's charts were unrolled and spread across the floor, weighted down with books. He traced the probable route of the Friesland from the Sunda Strait to the English Channel, his brow furrowed in concentration. The small envelope of reddish dust was subjected to a rigorous analysis with his powerful microscope, and a small scraping from the base of the enigmatic wooden bird was placed in a test tube and treated with a series of reagents. For hours, the only sounds in our sitting room were the scratching of his pen as he dispatched a veritable blizzard of telegrams, the bubbling of a retort over a Bunsen burner, and the mournful introspective strains of his violin. I knew better than to interrupt his thoughts, and so occupied myself with my own medical journals, though my mind constantly strayed back to the silent fog-bound ship and its vanished crew. Was it some new and terrible form of plague brought from the pestilential swamps of the East? Or was it the work of some cold-blooded and inhumanly efficient gang of murderers? Every theory I constructed seemed to crumble against the sheer impossibility of the facts. It was late in the evening when the first fruits of his labours began to arrive. A telegram messenger delivered a reply, which Holmes tore open and read with a grunt of satisfaction. "Listen to this, Watson," he said, his voice sharp with triumph. "I telegraphed the Dutch maritime authorities in Batavia with an inquiry about known troublemakers. They reply that a notorious Lascar seaman, a mutineer and pirate known only as Raja, has been active in the region. He is a man of exceptional cunning and cruelty, and is rumoured to be the leader of a shadowy cult that blends nihilism with obscure Eastern mysticism. He has a reputation for achieving his ends with a minimum of violence, but a maximum of terror." "A cult leader?" I exclaimed. "What would such a man want with a cargo of tea and spices?" "Precisely the question we must answer," Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming. He was already preparing another slide for his microscope. A short while later, he pushed away from the table with the cry of discovery. "The dust. It is, as I suspected, of volcanic origin. But more than that, my knowledge of geology tells me it is a very specific type of laterite soil, rich in iron oxide. Such a soil is found in only a handful of places on Earth. Given the ship's point of origin, I would stake my reputation that the soil comes from one island and one island only, Krakatoa, or what is left of it after the Great Eruption. But that is a desolate, uninhabited place. Why would anyone collect soil from there? Perhaps to sustain something that originated there or nearby," Holmes mused, his mind clearly following a chain of reasoning that was, as yet, invisible to me. His attention then turned to the test tube containing the wood scraping. The liquid had turned a faint but distinct shade of purple. "Astonishing," he breathed, "utterly astonishing. I have been consulting a monograph on rare tropical timbers. This reaction is characteristic of Virola elongata, the epinard tree, a species known for its psychoactive resin. But here is the crux, Watson. The epinard tree does not grow in the East Indies. It is found exclusively in one region of the world, the remote upper basins of the Amazon River in South America." I stared at him, utterly dumbfounded. "South America? But that is on the other side of the world. How can a bird carved from Amazonian wood find its way onto a ship from Batavia? And what is the connection to volcanic soil from Krakatoa?" "It is a magnificent contradiction," Holmes said, rubbing his hands together in delight. "A deliberate and audacious piece of misdirection. Our quarry is not merely a criminal. He is an artist, a man of intellect and grand vision. He wishes not only to succeed, but to mystify, to leave behind a puzzle that speaks of his global reach. This Raja is a foe worthy of our steel." He fell silent again, pacing back and forth across the hearthrug like a caged tiger. The net of his logic was being woven, thread by invisible thread. He saw the pattern, while I could see only the disconnected strands. As the hour grew late, he announced his intention for our next move. "We have gleaned all we can from the realm of science, Watson. Now we must descend into the murk of the human world. Put on your sturdiest boots and a plain travelling coat. We are going to a place where the secrets of the eastern seas are bought and sold for a pipe of opium." An hour later, we were deep in the labyrinthine and unsavoury district of Limehouse. Holmes had undergone a startling transformation. With a tweed cap pulled low over his eyes, a sailor's rough peacoat, and an uncouth shuffling gait, he was indistinguishable from the other denizens of the night. We entered the dim, cloying atmosphere of an opium den, a squalid cellar where human wreckage, comprised of sailors from every nation, lay sprawled on grimy bunks, lost in their narcotic dreams. Holmes, playing his part to perfection, procured a pipe and engaged in a low, guttural conversation with the den's proprietor. He then moved to a bunk occupied by an ancient, wizened Lascar seaman, his skin the colour and texture of old parchment. For a long time, Holmes spoke to him in a dialect I could not understand, his voice a low, persuasive murmur. I saw a few coins pass from Holmes's hand to the old man's. The seaman's eyes, clouded with the drug, seemed to clear for a moment, and he began to speak in a terrified, reedy whisper. Though I could not follow the words, the tone of dread was unmistakable. The old man gestured wildly with a trembling hand, his narrative punctuated by fearful glances towards the door. He spoke of a curse, a ship-borne horror known to the sailors of the Java Sea. He called it the Kamatian Berbisik, the Whispering Death. He described it as a phantom plague, a wind that carried madness and oblivion, leaving a vessel untouched but scoured of its human life. As he spoke, he mentioned a name, or rather a title, the Jagal, the Butcher, a man who served the Raja, a fearsome enforcer known for his prosthetic iron hook in place of a right hand. To my ears it sounded like the superstitious ramblings of a drug-addled mind. But Holmes listened with an unnerving intensity, as if every word were a gospel truth. When he finally rose to leave, his face was grim. "The superstitions of sailors often contain a kernel of truth, Watson," he said, as we emerged into the cold, damp air of the street. "They give a supernatural name to a phenomenon they cannot understand. This whispering death is not a phantom, but a very real and terrible weapon. And we now know the name of the man who wields it." Our return to Baker Street was met with an urgent message from Inspector Gregson. A new piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. A dock worker, a stevedore who had helped moor the Friesland upon its arrival, had come forward to the police, his conscience, or his fear, having finally overcome his greed. "The man's name is Hobbs," Gregson told us when we met him at Scotland Yard an hour later. "He says that on the night the Friesland was towed in, he was approached by a tall, gaunt man who seemed to appear out of the fog. This man had a wicked-looking steel hook where his right hand should be." "Silas the Hook Davies," Holmes exclaimed, striking the table with his fist. "The Jagal. Go on, Gregson." "This man offered Hobbs a sum of money, 20 golden sovereigns, simply to keep his mouth shut about seeing him disembark from the ship. Hobbs says the man was the only person who came off the Friesland. He was carrying a heavy leather satchel and vanished into the fog as silently as he had appeared." Hobbs, terrified and richer than he had ever been, kept his silence until he read about the vanished crew in the papers. He feared he was an accessory to some great crime and came to us. And so he was, Holmes said softly. An accessory to a crime far greater than he could possibly imagine. Gregson, this changes everything. The disappearance of the crew was not the objective of the mission. It was merely a prelude, a necessary clearing of the stage. The true purpose of the Friesland's voyage was to transport that man and the contents of his satchel to London. But what could be so valuable as to warrant the slaughter of 34 men? I asked. Holmes turned to me, his face more serious than I had ever seen it. Think, Watson. The sweet, cloying smell in the hold, the nearly empty jar of cloves to mask it, the crew, vanished without a trace of violence, the opium-addled sailors' talk of a whispering death. It all points to one inescapable conclusion: a poison of unimaginable potency, most likely airborne, that kills swiftly and silently. The crew was not kidnapped. They were exterminated, and their bodies were disposed of at sea days before the ship reached an English port. Silas Davies and the fanatical followers of Raja piloted the ship for the final leg of its journey. A cold dread washed over me as the sheer diabolical scale of the plot began to dawn. This was not about theft or mutiny. It was something far more monstrous. The cargo in the hold was a blind, Holmes continued, his voice low and urgent. The perfect cover. The real cargo was in that satchel, and the wooden bird carved from South American wood found on a ship from Asia was the calling card. It was the signal to Raja's confederates in London that the package had arrived. "Good heavens, Holmes!" Gregson sputtered. "A biological weapon in the heart of London. What is their target? What do they plan to do?" "That is the question that we must answer before the night is out," Holmes replied, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "This cult is not interested in money. Their leader is a nihilist, a man who finds meaning in destruction. Their goal will be chaos. They will aim for a target that is symbolic, a place where a single blow can strike at the very heart of the British Empire." He strode over to a map of London that hung on the wall of Gregson's office. His finger traced a path from the East India Docks westward, along the Thames. "They will have established a base, a laboratory of sorts, near the river for easy access," he mused. "The import-export businesses provide the perfect cover." He suddenly jabbed his finger at a specific spot on the map. There, a warehouse owned by the Orion Trading Company. I have had my eye on them for some time. They are a known front for all manner of illicit trade. It is the perfect lair for our serpent, Raja, and his butcher. "We can raid the place at once," Gregson declared, reaching for his telephone. "No," Holmes's voice cracked like a whip. "You would be walking into a death trap. These men are fanatics, and they are in possession of a substance that could kill every man you send in before they have even breached the door. We cannot use force. We must use guile. We must draw the snake from its hole." A cunning, almost predatory smile touched Holmes's lips. "Inspector, I shall require your complete cooperation. I am going to set a trap, and the bait will be an item that our murderous cultists will find utterly irresistible." Holmes's plan was one of audacious simplicity. He spent the next hour closeted with the editor of a prominent evening newspaper, a man who owed Holmes a great debt for his handling of a delicate matter involving a certain political figure. The result was a late edition headline that sent a shockwave through the city. Shocking affair of the Friesland. Mystery deepens, priceless artifact recovered. The article, penned with a masterful blend of fact and suggestive fiction, spoke of the baffling disappearance of the crew, but went on to hint that the authorities, aided by a consultant of some repute, had discovered the true purpose of the voyage. It claimed that a small but priceless religious artifact of immense significance to a secretive Eastern sect had been found concealed on the ship. For security reasons, the article concluded, this priceless object had been temporarily removed to the secure vaults of the British Museum's archaeological archives. "They will not be able to resist, Watson," Holmes explained as we sat in the gathering dusk of our Baker Street rooms. "Their weapon is in their hands, but their talisman, their symbol of power, the bird, is, they will believe, in ours. A fanatic cannot bear for his holy relics to be in the hands of infidels. They will believe the police are blundering, that we have grasped the shadow but missed the substance. They will try to retrieve the bird tonight, and we will be waiting." And so it was that shortly before midnight I found myself crouched with Holmes and a dozen of Gregson's plainclothed officers in the cold, cavernous shadows of the British Museum's colonnaded entrance. The fog had returned with a vengeance, muffling the city in a blanket of damp silence. The great museum was dark and imposing, a sleeping giant guarding the treasures of the world. Our trap was set. The hours crawled by. The cold seeped into my bones, and the silence was broken only by the distant chime of a clock tower and the soft footfalls of the bobbies on their beats. I was beginning to think that Holmes's stratagem had failed when he suddenly stiffened, his hand gripping my arm like a vice. "Look," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "To the left, by the railings." Out of the swirling fog, figures began to emerge. They moved with a furtive, silent grace that was utterly unnerving. There were 5 of them in all, dark, wraith-like shapes, led by a tall, gaunt man whose right arm ended in the glint of polished steel. It was Silas the Hook Davies. They flowed over the railings like shadows and crept towards a side entrance of the museum, their movements economical and precise. They were not common burglars. They were trained killers. As Davies produced a set of tools and began to work on the lock, Gregson gave a low whistle. The night erupted into chaos. Police whistles shrieked, and our men surged forward from their hiding places. The cultists, taken utterly by surprise, reacted with ferocious speed. They drew curved knives that glittered in the gaslight, and a desperate, savage fight broke out on the cold stone steps of the museum. I saw Silas Davies fell one constable with a brutal backhanded blow from his steel hook and turned to flee. But Holmes was on him in an instant. My friend was not a man of great physical bulk, but he possessed a wiry strength and was a master of the art of baritsu. There was a swift flurry of movement, a sharp cry, and the formidable enforcer was on the ground, with Holmes's knee planted firmly in his back and his wrists secured. The rest of the gang, seeing their leader captured, were quickly overwhelmed. The brief, violent struggle was over. The interrogation of Silas Davies took place in a stark, cold room at Scotland Yard. He was a formidable figure, even in chains, his face a mask of defiant hatred, his eyes burning with a zealot's fire. He refused to speak, answering every question with a contemptuous silence. Gregson was at his wits' end. "It's no use, Holmes." He'll go to the gallows before he utters a word." "Threats are useless against a man who does not fear death," Holmes replied calmly. He stepped forward, and in his hand he held the small black wooden bird. He did not speak of the gallows or of justice. He spoke of the bird. "It is beautifully carved," Holmes began, his voice conversational, almost academic. "The wood is Virola elongata, from the Amazon. A strange choice for an artist in Batavia, wouldn't you agree? Unless the carver wished to make a point about his international reach. A calling card left for his associates." Davy's eyes flickered. It was the first sign of a crack in his stony facade. Holmes continued, his voice still soft. "I also found traces of a peculiar reddish dust in the radio room of the Friesland. Volcanic soil from Krakatoa. An excellent medium, I am told, for maintaining the humidity needed to keep a certain type of amphibian alive and healthy during a long sea voyage. Specifically, a small, brightly coloured frog from the Amazon basin, whose skin secretes one of the most potent neurotoxins known to science. A poison that, when aerosolized, becomes a whispering death." At these words, Silas Davies let out a choked gasp. His face, already pale, turned a ghastly shade of white. The blood drained from his features as he stared at Holmes, not as a captor, but as one would stare at a sorcerer who had read the darkest secrets of his soul. "Your master, Raja, is a man of great intellect," Holmes pressed on, his voice like the relentless probe of a surgeon. "But he made one mistake. He underestimated the intellect of others. He believed his little puzzle of the bird and the soil would be an insoluble mystery, a final taunt. Instead, it was the key that unlocked his entire scheme. We know everything. We know about the frog. We know about the aerosol. We know that your target was not money or power, but chaos itself. We know you plan to release your whispering death into the ventilation system of the Houses of Parliament." The hook-handed man shuddered violently and finally broke. The dam of his fanatical loyalty burst, and a torrent of words, a full confession, poured out of him. His terror of Holmes's seemingly supernatural knowledge had accomplished what no threat of the hangman's noose ever could. Later that night, back in the comforting, familiar clutter of our Baker Street rooms, with a cheerful fire blazing in the hearth, Holmes gave a final summation of the case to myself and a profoundly shaken Mr. van der Heuvel. "The plot was as audacious as it was diabolical," Holmes explained, puffing on his favourite clay pipe. "This Raja is the high priest of a doomsday cult that seeks to purify the world through acts of mass terror. Their followers in South America captured the poison frog and smuggled it to their agents in Borneo. There, Raja and his inner circle prepared for the final stage of their plan. They needed to transport the creature, their ultimate weapon, to London. Your ship, Mr. van der Heuvel, was the perfect vehicle. Silas Davies and a few fanatics boarded in Batavia as crewmen. Days out from any port, in the vast emptiness of the Indian Ocean, they released the aerosolized toxin. It was, as Davies confessed, silent and instantaneous. The crew died where they stood. The fanatics, likely wearing primitive respirators, then had the grim task of committing 34 bodies to the deep. They piloted the ship themselves to London, disposed of the logbook to hide the gap of several weeks with no entries, and then Davies disembarked with the creature in his satchel, leaving the wooden bird behind as the triumphant signal of his arrival. Their plan was to unleash this horror upon Parliament during the state opening, an act that would have decapitated the British government and plunged the world into chaos. Thanks to the greed of a single dockworker and the beautiful, arrogant complexity of the clues they left behind, that catastrophe has been averted. Mr. van der Heuvel, pale but relieved, could only stammer his thanks. The full might of the British government was now silently and secretly moving to dismantle Raja's global network. The man himself had slipped the net for now, but his London cell was shattered and his weapon was secured. After our client had departed, I sat for a long time, contemplating the strange memento that now sat upon our mantelpiece, the sleek black wooden bird. It seemed to watch us from the shadows, a silent reminder of the profound evil that had so nearly triumphed. "It is a sobering thought, Holmes," I said at last, "that a plan of such magnitude, a threat so vast, could be unravelled from such tiny, insignificant details as a speck of dust and a splinter of wood." Holmes smiled his thin, enigmatic smile and picked up his violin. "That, my dear Watson, is the grand lesson of our profession," he said, as he drew the bow across the strings, filling the room with a melody that was at once melancholy and thoughtful. "The universe is rarely so lazy as to justify its grandest schemes with grand clues. The most shocking events, the most profound truths, often have their roots in the quietest, most overlooked details. It is the art of the logician to see the Atlantic in a drop of water, or, in this case, to see the fate of an empire in a grain of dust." And so he played on, the music a fitting requiem for the vanished crew of the Friesland, and a quiet celebration of a victory won not with force, but with the pure, cold light of reason.